All right. So this comes out of a talk I gave at MLA last January, the Modern Language Association, my last in-person conference. So it's nice to revisit it after 11 months. All right, so I'll just go ahead and get into it. I've worked on this, I'm working on this project with a collaborator, Seth Rudy, and this has kind of been a combo of, brought together our interests on notions of comprehension, like comprehensiveness in the 18th century and through the digital humanities. The English short title catalog finds that the first titular use of the phrase "at one view" appears in The Invasions of Germany from 1638. That was printed by a gentleman, quote, "well deserving that has suffered much in those wars." My collaborator, Seth, first noticed it while researching the 18th century encyclopedism. The phrase seemed to pop up everywhere, from Belial's warning in Paradise Lost that God's eye, quote, "views all things at one view," to simple tables displaying at one view currency values, chronologies, or the number of yards traveled when plowing an acre. The phrase was attached to numerous subjects, genres, and forms. We wanted to see what, if any, its primary associations were and how those associations changed over time. Since the database of the 18th century collections online, or ECHO, returns some 8,400 results for the phrase, we decided this was a good project for digital humanities. We took a two-pronged approach. The programmatic component uses digital text analysis to track the shifting semantic space of the phrase. I produced word vector models that enable us to identify the changing lexical neighborhoods of at one view, as well as words and phrases that perform the same rhetorical work but in different discursive contexts. The other component was a deep dive into the texts themselves, looking at our key phrases and a selection of closely associated terms used during what the data suggests were periods of significant change in frequency. What did we find? First, that the rise of the phrase, as well as the first years of its permanent decline, belong entirely to the 18th century, when image, eye, text, and mind were all understood to function as sites of knowledge beheld or comprehended at one view. Of several variants doing similar work, such as in one view, view at once, and view of the whole, at one view was by far was the most common, though all increased in frequency until the end of the century. In terms of popularity, the phrase peaked in the late 1730s, with high points in the 40s and a last hurrah in the 80s, after which, according to Google Ngrams, it never recovered. More broadly, as we'll see, we learned that the discursive movement of the phrase "at one view" tracks with overarching narratives of Enlightenment thought and proto-disciplinary development. More varied and secular contexts gradually overtake the religious and historical ones prevalent in the early part of the century. We also learned that the phrase seems to move away from seeing in the world or holding in the mind towards viewing on the page or the text. In other words, it moves on a medial trajectory towards information management. We found the outline of a story about shifting sites of epistemic power, of comprehension versus exhibition, of reading versus seeing, and of how certain kinds of literature privilege certain kinds of knowledge, perhaps because they could be represented in certain ways. This graph shows the co-occurrence frequencies from 1700 to 1800. It charts the number of times that key terms occur in ECHO within 10 words of the phrase "at one view." For about 20 years, it's a bit of a jumble. God, world, nature, and mind are fairly matched. But in the 1730s, table and tables runs away with it. There's a jump in the 1760s, twice as many co-occurrences as in the previous decade, and a spike in the last 2 decades. Table then emerges from the data as a word and a device of particular significance to the idea of comprehending knowledge at one view. The association, we think, tells us something about how the site and therefore the substance of the idea changed over the century. The words included in this graph may seem arbitrary, but we arrived at them through a computational approach that was designed to observe at one view's evolving lexical neighbors. The approach relies on modeling semantic spaces. using techniques first developed by computational linguists, but recently adapted to intellectual and literary history. In the word vector models that I created, each word is represented as a vector positioned in relation to the rest of the words in the corpus. The word vector space, in the word vector space, mathematical proximity, so the proximity between these mathematical positions of the words, corresponds to semantic similarity. You might imagine a lexical topography in which words occupy regions near frequently co-occurring words. So words that tend to appear together, or near one another within this mathematical space, and far from rarely co-occurring words, so far from words with which they're unlikely to appear together within a small sentence or sequence of words. By comparing the semantic neighborhoods of that particular phrase in vector models produced from different 20-year slices of the century, we can basically track how @OneView moves across the century, how it changes its lexical neighbors and its usage from the beginning to the end of the period. However, observing the shifts in a phrase usage tends to be more challenging than a word that undergoes a clear denotative change, as is often the focus in computational linguistics. Terms such as humane, which moves from being a noun, alternate spelling of human, to an adjective across the century, and novel, which moves from being an adjective to a noun as a genre. They change in specific ways that are easily observable in their different lexical neighbors at the beginning and the end of the period. Relative to this kind of linguistic change, the discursive movement of @OneView is quite subtle. In order to track this movement, I compared the 200 nearest neighbors of the phrase in the 20-year period between 1700 and 1719 to those 200 nearest neighbors at the end of the century, from 1780 to 1799. And so this would be the primary visualization I'm using here. I have more things that I could refer to, but I'm just trying to keep it simple. The orange words here, the green words here represent the words that are present on the 1700 list of nearest neighbors, but absent in the 1780 list. And the, let's see, I'm not sure if I said that. Green is 1700, but not 1780. Orange is 1780, but not 1700, right? So orange are the more recent words that appear at the end of the century, and the green words are the ones that appear at the beginning of the century around the phrase. It just helps to show the change of the words with which @OneView tended to co-occur in the first 20 years in green, and then the ones with it which it tended to co-occur in orange at the end of the century. And then all of these words, these neighbors, are plotted in an aligned semantic space, just a way of taking these two different semantic spaces from the beginning of the period and the end of the period and kind of mapping them on top of one another. Most of the 1700 words cluster in the bottom right quadrant of the graph. These words tend to be plural nouns referring to components of what is being viewed, including appearances, scenes, circumstances, and phenomena. While these are general words that could characterize any visual field, the more precise 1700 terms, such as colors, shapes, symmetry, and proportions, are positioned nearer to the 1780 cluster, right? So even here, the green words, the 1700 words, are kind of positioned based on their similar lexical context to the 1780 words, right? So we are literally kind of mapping these two spaces together. The 1780 terms largely appear in the upper left quadrant of the graph. The uppermost word area features words related to astronomy and optics, while the far left area contains words referring to print-oriented objects of reading. Terms such as diagram, map, charts, and schedule indicate textual technologies of comprehending @OneView, which are absent in the 1700 terms. This is the primary shift that we have observed in how 18th century writers used @OneView. It concerns the object of observation, but more than that, the medium of seeing. The 1700 terms in the graph tend to pertain to seeing things in the physical world. But as the century progresses, it becomes more common to comprehend complex phenomena by depicting them in print. We searched for works responsible for moving the phrase from the context of physical environments to that of textual ones. And we discovered that they were not the canonical, philosophical, and scientific titles that one might expect. A direct examination, so actually reading the text, of 670 instances printed between 1700 and 1719, reveals that the usage in the early part of the century falls into just a few categories. The first refers to divine or otherwise supernatural omniscience. God sees everything at one view. Those make up about 20% of the whole. The most common usage, however, is illustrated in an example from George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, in his play The Rehearsal, originally published in 1672, but regularly reprinted for the next 80 years. Quote, I turn over this book, and there I have, at one view, all that Persius, Montaigne, Seneca's tragedies, Horace, Juvenal, Claudian, Pliny, Plutarch's lives, and the rest have ever thought upon this subject. The passage is representative of a usage that amounts to at one reading or in one book. Where exactly does the Duke locate the one view, in the reader or the read? The inherent ambiguity is perhaps best demonstrated by authors who made direct, if improbable, comparisons of their works to single images. Francis Fuller, for example, in Medicina Gymnastica from 1705, offered to gather ancient opinions on exercise into such a compass that, quote, as in a sketch may appear at one view, unquote. His sketch covers 25 pages. You can't see it all at once or read it all at once, even if the information is all there at once. As I've already explained, it's not just about what is being seen, but also about how the phrase invokes different understandings of viewing and therefore of knowing. These examples, as with hundreds of other texts offering knowledge on subjects from scripture to history to language to law to gardening, evince a tension between or among sight, mind, and text as the place of knowledge at one view. From 1700 to 1719, though, words remain the third point of the triangle. The terms least frequently associated with at one view in this period were those indicating actual images, whether paintings, pictures, plates, engravings, maps, charts, or diagrams. In fact, despite appearing in similar lexical contexts, chart, map, and diagram rarely appear within 10 words of at one view in the echo corpus. Chart shows up 37 times, map 38, diagram only once. And this is over the entire 8,400 appearances of the phrase. Diagrams, charts, and maps, in other words, perform similar rhetorical and epistemological work as at one view, but in place of one another. And the phrase itself attaches overwhelmingly to the device of the table as the century progresses. It seems to have done somewhat gradually in the first half of the century and then more rapidly in the second. This is the same period in which John Bender and Michael Marinin have located the rise of, quote, a genealogy of visual correlation as a form of knowledge that constitutes what they call the culture of diagram. Their story begins during the time of the encyclopedia, that is from the 1750s and 1760s. The triumph of the table at almost the same moment makes it a related, albeit distinct branch of the same family tree. A deep dive into the 1760s, though, reveals potential generic drivers behind the broader medial reorientation. A selection of titles from the decade includes The Instructor or A Young Man's Best Companion, first published in the 30s, but expanded and reprinted more often in the 60s than any time before. The Universal Pocket Companion, The Trader's Pocket Companion, Vademecum or The Necessary Pocket Companion, The Gentleman's New Memorandum Book Improved, or The Merchant's or Tradesman's Daily Pocket Journal. That's just from the first 3 years of the 1760s. The prevalence of manuals and guidebooks, particularly in the first half of the decade, suggests a genre and market-driven rather than epistemologically or philosophically oriented shift in association. Medical papers from the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, reports to the Royal Society, and other works more scientific in nature are present, but very much in the minority. For the most part, the tabular information is simple, straightforward, practical, and numeric. Foreign currency exchange values, weights and measures, annuity values, dates, the price of accommodation in and outside London. In other words, the kind of information that can be easily organized, presented, and digested in this way, and perhaps become more important in the contemporary knowledge economy precisely because they can be so represented and appear so often in a popular genre. All right, now I'm moving to conclusion. This peculiar fact to kind of bring up here by way of conclusion is that although at one view and diagram never appear together in the last 2 decades of the 18th century, they are used in almost the exact same kind of lexical contexts. Diagram is the second most similar term to at one view for that period, despite never appearing together. And while the usage of the phrase falls off in the following century, that diagram dramatically rises. There's some subject level differences, but the key difference between how these two, this phrase and word are used, are the verbs with which they co-occur. The former group, as you can see on this table, largely concerns taking in a comprehensive perspective, and the latter entails producing a new figure. This doesn't necessarily explain why one falls in popularity and the other proliferates, but despite their similar linguistic environments, it does appear that the phrase and the term are doing something different in how they relate to information as potentially either received or produced. And from this study, then, we have learned that At One View afforded a distinctive set of rhetorical and epistemological functions for a brief period in the 18th century, wherein burgeoning print formats seemed to offer new techniques of comprehending. Thank you.